By the late 1980s, South Africa had reached a boiling point. The white minority government was trying to maintain control over an enraged black majority, and the entire nation was teetering on the edge of an all-out civil war. The state's economy was buckling under the weight of international sanctions, while domestic strikes and protests paralyzed the streets daily. The ruling class was completely out of options. To prevent a total collapse, the government realized they had to do the unthinkable. They had to negotiate with a man they had deliberately vanished into a prison cell 27 years prior. That man was Nelson Mandela. After decades of forced labor and isolation, he possessed the justification to demand absolute retribution. Instead, he chose to broker peace with the very people who had overseen his imprisonment. To understand that choice, you have to look at the system he was fighting. Apartheid was a highly engineered set of laws designed specifically to strip Black South Africans of their land, their right to vote, and their basic freedom of movement. This segregation was strictly enforced in every corner of everyday life. The state dictated where you could live, what jobs you could hold, and as seen here, even which taxis you were allowed to enter. As a young lawyer, Mandela initially believed in nonviolent resistance, but his philosophy shifted in 1960 during the Sharpeville massacre, when police opened fire on a peaceful crowd, killing 69 unarmed civilians. As the black community mourned over endless rows of wooden coffins, the trauma of the state's lethal force became impossible to ignore. Writing letters and staging peaceful sit-ins was no longer working. Realizing peaceful dialogue was being met with bullets, Mandela made a radical pivot. He went underground and co-founded an armed wing of his organization, directing operations to actively sabotage government infrastructure. He was a highly capable threat to the state, a leader who willingly deployed controlled violence against a violent regime. In 1962, an informant betrayed his location. During the infamous Rivonia trial, Mandela faced the death penalty for sabotage. Standing in court, he refused to yield, openly declaring that a democratic society was an ideal for which he was prepared to die. The court spared his life, sentencing him instead to life imprisonment. The government banished him to a remote island off the coast of Cape Town, fully intending to break his spirit and erase his name from history. For the next 18 years, Robben Island was his entire world. He was locked in a tiny cell with a concrete floor, surrounded by thick stone walls and tiny barred windows. The physical toll was severe. Prisoners spent their days swinging hammers in a blinding white limestone quarry that permanently damaged their eyesight. Even worse was the psychological punishment. When his mother and his eldest son died, the wardens forbade him from attending their funerals. During his confinement, Mandela studied the Afrikaans language to understand the mindset of his captors. By treating his guards with dignity and learning their history, he concluded that a future built on revenge would ensure the nation's total destruction. He emerged from Robben Island as a refined statesman. He had developed forgiveness into a calculated political tool, one he would use to dismantle the system that had imprisoned him. By 1989, the strategy of isolation had completely failed. Facing total economic collapse, South African President F.W. de Klerk recognized the system was doomed and began holding secret meetings with his most famous prisoner. Those negotiations led to February 11, 1990. After 27 years behind bars, a 71-year-old Nelson Mandela finally walked out of the prison gates as a free man. He was greeted by thousands of cheering supporters. Marching through the triumphant crowd with his fist raised, his release signaled to the world that the era of apartheid was fracturing. But freedom did not instantly guarantee peace. The next 4 years were highly volatile. Extremists on both sides actively tried to sabotage the transition, and a string of violent massacres threatened to derail the entire process. Mandela traveled tirelessly across the country to calm the rising tensions. He reached out directly to the architects of apartheid, noting that if you want to make peace with an enemy, you have to work with them until they become your partner. Mandela exercised the discipline to partner with his former oppressors, choosing to guide a traumatized nation away from the cliff edge, rather than letting it fall into civil war. That discipline paid off in April 1994, when the apartheid laws were officially abolished and South Africa held its first democratic election. Millions of black citizens, who had spent their entire lives under violent oppression, stood in lines stretching for miles, waiting patiently for hours just to cast their very first ballot. The African National Congress won a decisive victory, and Nelson Mandela was inaugurated as the first black president of a unified South Africa. Knowing the country was still deeply wounded, he established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It was a specialized court where perpetrators of political violence could confess their crimes in exchange for amnesty, prioritizing public truth and collective healing over punishment. Hearing the graphic confessions of torture and murder was agonizing for the nation, and the process was far from perfect. But simply by giving victims a voice, the Commission successfully defused the ticking time bomb of an endless cycle of retribution. Mandela dismantled an unjust system while maintaining his humanity. His legacy rests on the discipline he showed in guiding a traumatized nation away from the edge of catastrophe. Nelson Mandela's life is proof that hope and calculated forgiveness are more powerful forces for change than hatred and revenge.